Thank you for joining us today on the Real Estate Mentor Podcast, the #1 real estate mentorship podcast on the internet today. I am Jonathan Klunk, your host, also a real estate agent based out of Louisville, Kentucky, but sell in all 50 states. And today on the podcast, we are honored to have Scott Harper back with us. He is a real estate attorney at Bluegrass Land Title, also in Louisville, Kentucky, and in Lexington. And we are going to dig in a little bit further to 1031 exchanges. So we had Scott on the podcast, I think last season, where we got down and deep into the weeds of 1031 exchanges, but it was more kind of on the surface of what is it, how does it work? And I wanted him to come back because I get a lot of questions from my investor clients about 1031 exchanges. They all know they exist. They know the basic principles of how they work, but I'm starting to get more technical questions. So I thought that this would be a really good topic for us to cover, because if my investor clients are having these questions, then I'm sure a lot of you are as well. So Scott, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be back. Always excited to dive a little bit further in for things that can help your clients, help my clients, and help people that want to get into the real estate space.
Absolutely. And that's what this show is about. And so if you own any investment property and you are thinking about selling and you are looking for ways to avoid paying that capital gains tax at the point of sale, then a 1031 exchange might be for you. I'm going to let Scott go into some of the basics of the 1031 in case you don't want to go back and listen to the other podcast episode. But the important things to remember, I think, Scott, and I'll let you elaborate on this, is number one, obviously cannot be your primary residence, so has to be an investment property. And number two, you have to be purchasing another property. So at the point of sale, you need to know that you can't just take that money and not pay the capital gains. You have to actually not touch it at all and do something else with it. So can you take a few minutes and just give us the high-level overview and recap 1031?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 1031 exchange is designed to be a tax deferral vehicle so that an individual who owns investment property has the ability to exchange one property here for another property over here. The idea being that markets change, investment strategies change, and instead of having to pay taxes just because you are going to be shifting how you are investing or where, the IRS is allowing you to replace properties in different markets. The goal is not necessarily to avoid paying taxes, but that's exactly how society is now using it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the goal essentially, originally, the original intent was to be able to exchange properties. We still do that, but many times we say, let's exchange properties so we don't have to pay taxes instead of let's do a 1031 because we wanted to do an exchange anyways. Generally speaking, it has to be investment property. Generally speaking, you're going to need to buy property that is like kind. You're going to have to spend the same amount of money that you sold for. And you're going to have strict time frames in order to do that in terms of notification of 45 days and a total time of 180 days to complete that transaction.
Okay. So important things to note here are that whenever you sell property, you want to be ready to buy something else. There are timelines surrounding this. And so you have a certain period of time in which you need to purchase something else following the sale. And number three, I don't think that we covered here, is that you cannot touch the money. You have to have a qualified intermediary involved, like Scott, to take that money at closing, and then it sits in their account until you are ready to make your next purchase.
That's absolutely right. The whole purpose of me being here is to hold the money so that you're not in receipt or constructive receipt of those funds.
And so if you want to dig into any of those, if you want to understand those timelines better, if you want to understand the minutia of the process, definitely go back and listen to the other podcast episode where we had Scott on talking about the 1031 exchange. But today, Scott, with you, I want to dig a little bit deeper into this. One question that I recently had from an investor is they're looking to sell a property in the Louisville, Kentucky market, another property in the Tennessee market, and they want to combine those funds together and make one significantly larger purchase. Is that something that the 1031 exchange will accommodate?
Yes, you can do the 1031 exchange for multiple properties. You can be selling multiple properties and buying a single. You could be selling a single and buying multiple. What really matters, two big things. Number one is going to be the sale and purchase prices. The napkin rule basically defines that when you sell a property for X, you have to buy a property for X or greater. If you pay less than what you sold for, that difference would be an amount that would become taxable. Doesn't destroy your exchange, but it does become taxable. The big number two is going to be that you have strict timelines that you have to follow. In a typical 1031 exchange, you have from sale date, 45 days to identify your next property or properties, and 180 days total to close. When you're doing multiple properties, you have those same time frames, but they're now working in conjunction with one another. So if you have two properties that you are selling and you sell property on the first of the month, your time frame now starts. But if you don't sell your property until the 15th of that same month, now that the timeline doesn't start, you're still using the timeline from that first property to complete the exchange using all of those properties.
Okay. So if you're selling two properties to purchase one, and the first property sells on March 1st, and maybe the other one is taking a little bit longer to sell. Let's say that it takes 30, 45 days. This entire process is going to be based on the time of the first sale and not give any credit or leniency because the second one took longer to sell. Is that correct?
That is correct. It still works in that scenario where it takes 46 days for you to sell property two, because the timeline for identification, you're still good so long as in property one, you've identified the replacement property. You can still complete the transaction even if you're outside of the 45-day window on selling property two.
Okay. I think I understand that. But you did bring up another good point, and this is something that I was going to ask you about, is, if the property that you sold and you're 1031ing into a new property, if you don't use the full amount of that sale, what happens to that? Do you just have a small amount of exposure for the difference, or does the complete thing, the complete transaction kind of unwind?
Yeah. So the industry term on that is going to be called boot. And essentially it's going to be amounts that you are receiving from the exchange. So the rule says that whatever you sell for, you got to buy for. If you end up buying for less than what you sell for, that difference is going to be considered boot or gain. And you are looking at taxation on that amount that you become in receipt of. It does not destroy your entire 1031 exchange. And sometimes people decide that it's worth, based on their strategy for real estate investing, they're okay accepting a certain amount of boot and still doing a 1031 exchange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I can see where, there would be implications for that. Like, if you have $1 million property and you really want to downsize into something else, and, so your sale price is $1 million, but if you're going to purchase something else that, let's say, is $750,000, then you're only on the hook for paying capital gains on the difference between those two numbers, correct?
Correct. It wouldn't be any more than that. And I think another great example is coast to coast, you can do 1031 exchanges. You mentioned earlier Louisville, Kentucky and a property in Tennessee. If you were to have a West Coast property and they were selling that, valuations out there are much greater. You can get a lot more for your money in Kentucky. And so somebody doing a 1031 exchange may have one property in California, and that sales price could buy you 4 properties in Kentucky. But the weight of having to manage 4 properties versus one may be more than that investor is willing to do or may not feel comfortable with. So they may replace and accept some boot.
And that's where it comes down, to the individual investment strategy of each person, as you mentioned earlier, because those will certainly change over time. I'm actually starting to have conversations with investors now too about how taxing it is sometimes to manage investment real estate. It's not really a passive income stream, even if you have property managers in place. And that's certainly true for short-term rentals, which has, a lot more involvement from the owners on a daily basis. Again, even if you have a management company, still a lot of communication. So, some people I can see probably wanting to sell multiple properties and exchanging into a single larger property. So you have fewer people that you're speaking with and managing. Maybe you have a rental portfolio of, 150 properties, and that's when it makes sense to probably sell the entire thing as a portfolio rather than piecemealing those sales, even if you could get more, because it's really going to drag out that timeline in order to include that money in the 1031 exchange, since there's a limited window of time. But maybe you want to go into a strip mall. Maybe you want to go into self-storage, something like that. That would be, I think, a really good use of the 1031 exchange in a portfolio sale and reducing your management exposure so that you get more time back. But correct me if I'm wrong about that. That's one thing that I think I had on my list for us to discuss next, is whenever we're talking about that like-kind exchange. I think that confuses a lot of people. Does it have to be residential for residential? Can it be land for commercial, condo for land? How does that work? Is it anything related to real estate?
Yeah. So I think that really comes down to, to your point about exit strategy. The longer you spend in real estate, the more you realize that there are different categories in terms of the finesse or the character and how you want to run your business. So understanding what your exit strategy is and understanding what other investors' exit strategies or entry strategies might be can be very beneficial in preparing your property for sale. So when it comes to 1031 exchanges and what is like kind, the law is very favorable in terms of how it defines like kind. For the most part, if you are selling real estate, you are also buying real estate. That would fall within the category of like kind. So to your point, could you do vacant land and then go buy a condo? You could. Could you do an office building and then buy single family residences? You could do that. So it's very liberal in terms of what you can buy or can't buy.
Okay. So the improvements on the land don't have to be similar. You could do strip mall, you can do storage, like self-storage, you can do RV park. These are all really hot investment discussions right now.
Yeah, you can. I think the biggest thing I would say is fixture. You want to make sure, like with an RV park, don't consider the RVs as part of the transaction unless they are affixed to the land.
Right. Okay. Good point there. One thing that I was just thinking about is a conversation that you and I had with a client of mine a couple months ago. And this is somebody who was wanting to do a 1031 exchange, but was, he's a very creative individual, and that's where I really thrive. So I brought you in on that discussion because they want to do a 1031 exchange whenever they sell the property, but they were also looking at a deal that included some owner financing. So we had a very in-depth conversation about how to structure that deal, because at the point of sale, that is going to essentially trigger that 1031 exchange timeline to start if that's what they wanted to do. So walk us through kind of that scenario and what you advised us to do, and I might add a little color to it.
Yeah, so I'll keep it brief and I'll let you add the color. I'm just going to draw the lines. You fill it in for me. But I would basically say that in those instances, I would almost argue you can't actually do seller finance when it comes to a 1031 exchange. The big however is you could do a seller finance 1031 exchange so long as the transaction is actually occurring in terms of transfer. And what I mean by that is, one, your seller cannot be in receipt of funds. Your qualified intermediary has to be that person holding on to those funds. The second thing is you really want to have it happen all at one time because you end up having such strict timelines. So what you have to do in order to accomplish that is to actually find someone who is willing to buy the note that you have and essentially collect the payments, so that you're really converting it out of a seller finance.
One thing that we talked about doing was, let's see, the term just kind of flew out of my head right now, but it would contract for deed.
Sure.
To where it's not really a sale. Obviously, the seller would still have to go through the foreclosure process if someone was not honoring, the buyer was not honoring their part of the transaction and making those monthly payments. But with the contract for deed, they were going to make a very large down payment and then make monthly payments until they were able to pay off the entire property. So, still under a 3-year period, a 5-year period, they would essentially get financing for the balance when they were ready to complete the purchase. And then that's when the deed would transfer to the buyer. So the seller technically still owns the property, but because they had received money for that, under the laws of the state of Kentucky, the repossession process would have to start. If they defaulted on that, they can't just simply walk in, change the locks, or do something like that. Now, under a scenario like that, would that qualify for a 1031 exchange, meaning kicking the sale timeline down the road to where the deed actually transferred? And B, any monies that they receive, I assume that would need to be paid into the intermediary's account and not received by the seller? Or is that just excluded from part of the financials of the sale since it didn't happen at closing?
Yeah. So essentially you're looking at it and you can structure the contract for deed in multiple different ways. Maybe it's almost an option, right? Where they're paying funds up front. What are those funds for? Are they considered a sale, or are they considered just funds that are received as a general business revenue? And so they're going to be taxed in their own separate way, but not as capital gains. So when you look at structuring a 1031 exchange, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that it's all about timelines and it's about the actual sale. So until you have a sale, you have not begun a 1031 exchange. And if you are looking to avoid taxes on or defer taxes on that initial sum that's paid, what you would want to do is sell the property and assign that contract for deed to a separate third-party buyer who is then collecting the payments from the person living in the property. And then when that contract comes to fruition, when it finishes or balloons, that's when the buyer would do their refinance and the investor who had originally bought your note would then get fully paid out.
Very interesting.
So there's multiple ways to structure it. The reality is that the 1031 exchange is simple. It's based on sale, replace, not in receipt of funds, based on a strict timeline. In that scenario, we are figuring out the best time to do the 1031 exchange, and we're bringing in a third party to assist the seller so that they can be freed up to go do what they need to do. And you then have an investor who works in buying notes and collecting interest and seeing how they can make money over a period of 2 years, while then looking at the buyer who doesn't have the credit score to be able to do it today, but they have some of the cash on hand to be going in that direction. Everybody finds a way to win.
Yeah. I like that. It adds even more complexity to it. I love those complex transactions.
And I think it's in terms of finding a quality agent, you need to have a real estate agent who is thinking in three-dimensional terms so that you have the ability to say, maybe we can't make it happen with the two of us, but let's bring in someone else. And now we can make this whole thing work.
Ability to see the big picture, but also have those connections as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Scott, anything else that we should discuss about 1031 exchanges today?
Yeah, so I think biggest thing to also keep in mind, just because I get this question a lot, would be like vacant land and being able to build on it. So many times people want to buy property from someone that they are related to or they know. Many times people want to buy vacant land and they want to build what they want on it. Inventory is tight. It's hard to find the things that you're looking for. And many times you're on tight timelines. And so you want to be able to construct what you're looking for. And to those 2 points, I would say that it is possible to be able to do a 1031 exchange with someone that you might be related to. However, the oversight on that is going to be stricter. You're usually going to have to make sure that people are holding those properties for longer and you have the ability to justify fair market value. And when it comes to acquisitions for vacant land and being able to build on them, those are things that you can do, but they're not as simple as a 1031 exchange generally. You're going to need to use a qualified intermediary who can help by essentially acquiring property, helping build, and then you do your 1031 exchange. So there are ways to structure a lot of creative things when it comes to 1031s. You just have to be working with the right people and make sure everybody's fully on the same page with what you want to do and what you can do.
And clarification on that, if you're buying the land, let's say as an investment, then you need to build an investment property on there. You can't buy it as an investment, let an LLC hold on to that land and then build your primary residence on there.
No, you wouldn't do it for those purposes. The intention is that it's designed for investment purposes, and the IRS is very clear that primary residency even flips are not going to be considered investing for 1031 exchange purposes.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that point too. And then we dig into that a little bit more on the previous episode as well. So if you want more information on 1031 exchanges, if you want to go back and understand the basics of it first, go back, listen to that podcast episode, then come back and listen to this one again. And some of these pieces might make a little bit more sense. Scott, thank you so much for being on the show with us today. Please tell everybody how they can get in touch with you if they have questions or how to follow you on social media.
Yeah, so social media is probably the best. The Southern Lawyer on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook as well, D. Scott Harper. But 1031 exchanges, they can happen all over the country. So even though I'm located here in Louisville, if you have property in the Pacific Northwest, then you're buying something in Florida, I can still help you out.
The Southern Lawyer, great handle. And my handle is Top Louisville Realtor. Please reach out and follow me on Instagram. Let me know if you have any questions about investing in real estate anywhere in the United States. Just like Scott, I'm with EXP. I have a network of EXP agents, commercial, residential, investment all over the country. Happy to work with you through that process. Thank you so much for joining us on the Real Estate Mentor podcast. We have another episode coming up for you very soon.